For years, Rebecca played the role of the perfect wife, standing by her powerful husband as he built their empire. But when he walked into their family dinner with a shocking revelation, he thought he was in control, until she unveiled a truth that would change everything. Stay until the end to see how power can shift in an instant. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming. The Sterling Grand Hotel stood as a monument to luxury, its towering glass facade reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Inside, the elite of Sterling Industries gathered in the exclusive dining suite known as the Crown, an opulent space where business and family affairs intertwined under the weight of legacy. Every year, the company's most influential figures convened here for the annual Sterling Industries family dinner, a night that was far more than just a meal. It was politics, strategy, and silent power plays in equal measure. Rebecca Sterling moved through the space with effortless grace, every step calculated, every gesture deliberate. At 42, she had perfected the art of being the perfect corporate wife, a role she had played with quiet precision for over 15 years. Her navy blue dress was elegant yet conservative, her diamond earrings understated but impossible to ignore. The staff adjusted the lighting at her instruction, dimming it just enough to soften the room's sharp edges. At 22 degrees Celsius, the temperature was kept exactly as her husband, Marcus Sterling, preferred, because he disliked being too warm during important discussions. She glanced at the table, taking in the meticulous arrangement of the place settings, the crystal glasses catching the glow of the chandelier overhead. A familiar weight settled in her chest as she anticipated the evening ahead. She had done this before, many times. But tonight, something was different. "Mom." Rebecca turned as her daughter, Sophie Sterling, entered the room, her striking presence impossible to ignore. At 19, Sophie carried herself with the same confidence as her father, but her keen intelligence and sharp intuition were unmistakably inherited from Rebecca. Beside her walked Samuel, Sophie's twin brother, quieter but no less observant. Where Sophie was charismatic, Samuel had a reserved intensity that reminded Rebecca of her own father. Sophie kissed Rebecca on the cheek, then took in the scene with a knowing smirk. "Everything looks perfect, as always." Samuel adjusted his tie, his expression serious. "The board members are arriving downstairs. Grandfather's driver just called." Rebecca nodded, her lips curving into a practiced smile. "Thank you, Sam. And remember what we talked about. Engage, show interest, but don't commit to anything business-related." Samuel gave her a knowing look. "I remember, Mom." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Another evening of watching Dad put on his performance while we play the role of the loving family. How thrilling." Rebecca studied her daughter carefully. Tonight was important, more than usual. "Isn't it always?" Sophie sighed, but something in Rebecca's tone made her straighten slightly. "Everything okay?" Rebecca smiled, brushing a hand over Sophie's cheek. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Before she could say more, Eleanor Sterling entered the room. At 76, Marcus's mother was still an imposing figure, her silver hair styled to perfection, her posture regal. She had been married to Richard Sterling, the son of the company's founder, the man who had turned a modest hotel business into a global empire. Rebecca acknowledged her with a polite nod, both out of respect and silent annoyance. Eleanor's sharp gaze swept the room before she glanced at her platinum watch and frowned. "Let me guess. My son is late to his own dinner." "He mentioned a last-minute meeting," Rebecca replied evenly. Eleanor scoffed, unimpressed. Richard was never late a day in his life. Punctuality is respect, and respect is the foundation of business. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. You give him too much leniency. Rebecca's smile didn't falter. Shall we greet our guests? Eleanor studied her for a moment longer before giving a curt nod. Indeed. Over the next 30 minutes, the room filled with some of the most powerful figures in Sterling Industries. The CEO of their tech division arrived with his wife, followed by the company's general counsel, the heads of international development and finance, and, finally, the board's chairman, Harold Winters, a contemporary of Richard Sterling's, easily recognizable by his signature red pocket square. Rebecca greeted each guest personally, remembering the names of their children, their favorite wines, the topics that intrigued them most. At precisely 7:15 p.m., 14 of the 16 seats at the table were occupied. Only 2 remained empty, the one at the head of the table reserved for Marcus and another yet to be claimed. At 7:20 p.m., Rebecca gave a subtle nod to the waiting staff. Let's begin with cocktails. Eleanor sighed from her place at the table. Always the showman. Even as a child, he couldn't just enter a room. He had to make an entrance. Rebecca merely smiled, and then, as if on cue, the double doors to the dining suite swung open. Marcus Sterling had finally arrived. At 45, he was still strikingly handsome, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who had never known true failure. His tailored suit, perfectly knotted tie, an easy smile spoke of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. But it wasn't his appearance that silenced the room. It was the woman at his side. She was young, 28, perhaps 29, with sleek black hair and delicate features. Her red dress was both elegant and daring, hugging her figure in a way that left no doubt about what it concealed: a 5-month pregnancy. Good evening, everyone. Marcus's voice carried across the room, smooth and composed. Apologies for the delay. I'd like to introduce Vanessa Chen, our Director of Special Projects for the Asian markets. He paused, his gaze settling on Rebecca with something close to amusement, as if he had been waiting for this moment. And the mother of my son, the next heir to Sterling Industries. The silence that followed was absolute. Every gaze in the room shifted, moving between Marcus, Vanessa, and Rebecca, waiting for the inevitable explosion, the public unraveling of a woman scorned. Eleanor's hand tightened around her glass. The twins exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable, but Rebecca... She did not scream, she did not cry, she did not waver. Instead, she stood gracefully, her expression unreadable except for the faintest glimmer of something unexpected. Politeness. She extended a hand toward Vanessa. Welcome to our family dinner, Miss Chen. Her voice was warm even. Please, have a seat, right here, as the guest of honor. Vanessa hesitated, startled. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. Neither had Marcus. The confident smirk that had been playing at his lips faltered ever so slightly. His eyes narrowed as he watched Rebecca take control of the moment. You said she would be upset, Vanessa whispered to Marcus as he finally took his seat at the head of the table. She's in shock, Marcus murmured back, forcing a smile. It'll hit her later. Across the table, Eleanor exchanged a knowing glance with Rebecca, while the twins maintained carefully neutral expressions. But for those who knew them well, there was something, just a flicker, of anticipation in their eyes. As the first course was served, Rebecca effortlessly resumed her role as hostess, steering the conversation as if nothing had happened. She asked questions. She made observations. She guided the discussion. And, to everyone's surprise, Vanessa was intelligent. She knew business. She understood international markets. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "Garrett, didn't you express doubts about our Shanghai expansion last quarter?" Harold Winters cleared his throat. "I did. The projections seemed optimistic without a clear differentiator." Vanessa sat up straighter. "The differentiator is understanding that Chinese consumers don't want a Western hotel with Chinese decor. They want an experience that honors their cultural values while maintaining the luxury they associate with our brand." Marcus was watching now, his unease growing. This evening was not going as planned, and for the first time in years he felt something he hadn't expected to feel tonight: uncertainty. Rebecca lifted her wineglass, watching him with quiet amusement. She had been preparing for this moment for a very, very long time. Rebecca Sterling maintained her perfect composure as the dinner progressed, navigating the conversation with the same precision she had mastered over 15 years of marriage. Her voice was steady, her expressions controlled, and if anyone noticed the flicker of something unreadable behind her eyes, they were wise enough not to mention it. Across the table, Marcus kept a close watch on her, his smile confident, but his posture just a little too rigid. This was not the reaction he had anticipated, and Rebecca knew it. He had expected tears, outrage, humiliation, a public unraveling that would make her powerless in the face of his carefully orchestrated coup. Instead, she had welcomed Vanessa, seated her with the dignity befitting an honored guest, and continued dinner as if her husband's betrayal was nothing more than a business acquisition to be analyzed. Vanessa, for her part, was visibly uncomfortable. She had come expecting hostility, perhaps even a dramatic exit that would leave Marcus victorious. Instead, she was caught in a quiet storm, one where Rebecca held the reins of control without so much as raising her voice. She was young, ambitious, and intelligent. Rebecca saw that clearly. But intelligence alone was not enough to survive in this world. Rebecca had learned that firsthand. The dinner continued with polite conversation, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, and the occasional awkward silence. Vanessa found herself drawn into discussions about Sterling Industries' future, unknowingly revealing more than she perhaps intended. She spoke of her vision for the company's expansion into the Asian market, of her belief in rebranding certain properties to cater to cultural preferences rather than imposing Western standards. She was sharp. Rebecca let her speak, let her impress the board members with her ideas. It was not a mistake to do so, it was strategy. Across the table, Harold Winters listened intently. The chairman of the board had always been a careful observer, and tonight was no exception. He had known Marcus's father, Richard, well enough to understand that power in the Sterling family was never as simple as it seemed. His gaze shifted between Marcus, Vanessa, and Rebecca, and though he said little, Rebecca could sense his calculations. When the main course was cleared away, Marcus decided it was time to reassert control. He tapped his glass with a fork, drawing attention back to himself. "Since we are discussing the future of Sterling Industries," he said smoothly, "I believe now is the perfect time to introduce the board to the next phase of our expansion strategy." Rebecca sipped her wine, waiting. Marcus turned his attention to the board members. "The company has been in a state of transformation, and as we look ahead, we must adapt to change. With our recent expansions into Singapore and the exciting projects Vanessa has been spearheading in Shanghai, we are at the brink of something unprecedented." He gestured to Vanessa, who straightened in her seat. "Despite our personal relationship, Vanessa's work stands on its own merits. Her insights into the Asian luxury market will open doors that have long remained closed to Western companies. Vanessa nodded, though she seemed uncertain where this speech was heading. To ensure we maximize this opportunity, Marcus continued, I have begun preliminary work on the establishment of a new division, Sterling Asia. This subsidiary will oversee all operations in the Pacific region and position us for long-term dominance in the market. Rebecca placed her wineglass down. Sterling Asia? Marcus turned to her, his smile almost patronizing. Yes, I've had our legal team drafting the framework for its launch. Of course, this is still in the early stages, but I wanted the board to hear it from me first. Rebecca's gaze flickered toward Harold, who frowned slightly. And who will be overseeing Sterling Asia? Rebecca asked. Marcus exhaled, as if indulging her. Vanessa, of course. A murmur ran through the room. Even Vanessa seemed taken aback by the announcement. Rebecca leaned forward, resting her hands lightly on the table. That's quite a bold move, Marcus. He smiled. I believe in bold moves, as do you. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. She had spent 15 years learning how he operated, how he viewed power and control. He had never seen her as a threat because she had never allowed him to. That, she realized, had been his greatest mistake. You mentioned that the framework has already been drafted, she said. That suggests this decision has been in the works for some time. Marcus gave a smooth nod. Naturally? Rebecca tilted her head. How long? Silence fell. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Marcus cleared his throat. A few months. Rebecca's lips curved into a knowing smile. That's interesting. A few months ago, February, if I'm not mistaken, was around the time Vanessa confirmed her pregnancy, wasn't it? The tension in the room tightened like a coiled spring. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. Rebecca turned to her, her voice calm, almost gentle. That must have been an exciting time for you, Vanessa. A child on the way, a new career opportunity. Vanessa hesitated, glancing at Marcus. Yes, I suppose it was. Rebecca nodded. And, Marcus, if I recall correctly, February was also when you first presented the Singapore expansion plan to the board, wasn't it? Marcus's smile was thinner now. Yes, it was part of a broader strategic shift. A shift that involved moving large assets into offshore accounts, Rebecca continued. Silence. Vanessa slowly turned toward Marcus. What? Marcus forced a laugh. This is hardly the place to discuss. Rebecca reached for a folder beside her and slid it across the table toward Harold Winters. These are financial records detailing asset transfers Marcus has authorized over the past 7 months. More than $43 million in company assets have been funneled into private accounts under the name of Sterling Asia. Accounts that, as of this evening, have been frozen. Vanessa paled. Harold opened the folder, his face darkening as he scanned the documents. This is a restructuring effort, Marcus said sharply. It's perfectly legal. It's embezzlement, Rebecca corrected, her voice still even. And now it's a legal matter. The boardroom was deathly silent. Vanessa pushed away from the table, shaking her head. Marcus, tell me this isn't true. He reached for her hand, but she pulled back. You said Sterling Asia was approved by the board, she whispered. Marcus hesitated. Rebecca folded her hands in front of her. It wasn't. Vanessa turned away from him, her breath unsteady. This is absurd, Marcus snapped. You're making it sound like This isn't about what it sounds like, Marcus. It's about what it is, Rebecca interrupted. The company's future is at stake, and you've been planning an escape route at its expense. Marcus's jaw clenched. Harold Winters closed the folder. We'll convene an emergency board meeting first thing tomorrow morning." Rebecca nodded. "I've already arranged for it." Marcus stared at her, the realization sinking in. This was not the moment of triumph he had envisioned. It was something else entirely. Rebecca rose from her seat. "Enjoy your evening, Marcus. Tomorrow will be a long day." As she walked away from the table, Marcus remained frozen in place. For the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. And Rebecca Sterling had just made her first move. The next morning, as the city skyline bathed in the soft light of dawn, Rebecca Sterling stood before the full-length window of her suite, gazing at the horizon. Today was the day everything changed. She had spent 15 years playing the perfect corporate wife, maneuvering in the shadows, ensuring that her children's legacy would not be squandered by a man who mistook privilege for power. Now, the time for quiet manipulation was over. She exhaled, adjusting the cuff of her charcoal gray blazer, the same shade as the storm gathering around Marcus. At precisely 8:45 a.m., she stepped out of her suite, her heels clicking against the marble floors with quiet authority. She was not alone. At her side walked David Chen, Sterling Industries' chief legal counsel, and a team of financial analysts who had spent the last 3 months gathering evidence, cross-checking records, and preparing the case against her husband. This was not a reckless play. It was a meticulously orchestrated move that had been in the making for years. As they approached the executive boardroom, Rebecca noted the tension in the air. Harold Winters, already present, was deep in conversation with other members of the board, their voices hushed yet charged with urgency. The moment she entered, the room fell silent. Even those who had doubted her influence were now forced to acknowledge the weight of her presence. She took her seat at the head of the long mahogany table, once Marcus's place of dominance, now her battlefield. The leather portfolio before her contained everything necessary to dismantle his illusion of control. Marcus himself had not yet arrived, but his attorney, James Warrington, was already in place, his expression carefully blank. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors swung open and Marcus strode in, his usual air of confidence dimmed but not yet extinguished. He wore the same tailored suit he had always favored, but there was something less polished about him today. The set of his jaw, the slight tension in his posture, Rebecca saw it all. He was a man grasping at the remnants of power, unwilling to admit he had already lost. Marcus took his seat across from her, his eyes locking onto hers. "I assume we're skipping formalities," he said, his tone clipped. Rebecca clasped her hands together, her expression unreadable. "We all have a great deal to discuss." Harold Winters cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, let's establish the nature of this meeting. We are here to review evidence regarding recent financial discrepancies within Sterling Industries and to determine the necessary steps for ensuring the company's future stability." James Warrington leaned forward. "My client was given less than 24 hours' notice regarding these so-called discrepancies. That is hardly enough time to—" "The board has had 3 months to review the internal audit," Rebecca interrupted smoothly. "Marcus was simply the last to be informed." A murmur spread around the table. Warrington pressed his lips together but said nothing. David Chen placed a stack of documents before the board members. "What you have in front of you are verified records detailing unauthorized asset transfers from Sterling Industries into shell corporations based in Singapore. Over $43 million have been funneled into accounts that list Marcus Sterling as the sole beneficiary." Marcus scoffed. "This is a gross misinterpretation. Those were strategic reallocations meant to optimize our international holdings." "Without board approval?" Rebecca asked. Silence. Marcus's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Harold flipped through the documents. The records show a pattern of increasing withdrawals, coinciding with the timeline of Marcus's new initiative, Sterling Asia. This is not standard corporate restructuring. This is deliberate misappropriation of company funds. Vanessa Chen, seated at the far end of the table, had remained silent up until this point, her hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly. But now her voice was cold. You told me everything was approved. Marcus turned to her, his expression softening as if he could control the damage. Vanessa, She shook her head. You lied. You used me, used our project to cover your tracks. Rebecca watched the scene unfold, her gaze sharp but emotionless. She had no sympathy for Marcus's predicament. He had dug this hole himself. The difference was that, for once, he had no control over how deep it would go. Marcus straightened, attempting to regain his composure. This is nothing more than a power grab, he said, directing his focus back to the board. Rebecca has spent years playing the obedient wife, but let's not be naive. She's been waiting for this moment, setting me up. Rebecca let out a quiet laugh. You give me too much credit, Marcus. Your downfall is entirely your own doing. Harold cleared his throat. Given the overwhelming evidence, we must discuss the next steps. As of this moment, Marcus Sterling is officially removed from his position as CEO of Sterling Industries. The room fell into stunned silence. James Warrington leaned forward. You can't just— I can, Rebecca interjected. And I have. She pulled another document from her portfolio, sliding it across the table. This is the original trust agreement signed by Richard Sterling. It stipulates that, in the event of financial misconduct, the controlling shareholder has the authority to remove the CEO. As it stands, I control 57% of the company's voting shares. Marcus's face paled. Harold exhaled, nodding. I've reviewed the documentation. It's legally binding. Vanessa stared at Marcus as realization dawned. You knew about this, didn't you? She whispered. That's why you were moving assets. You were preparing to leave. Marcus rubbed a hand over his face, frustration bleeding into his expression. Rebecca spoke once more, her voice calm but firm. You have two options, Marcus. Sign the resignation agreement, retain your personal assets, and leave quietly. Or— She let the word hang in the air. We press charges for corporate fraud and embezzlement. A cold hush swept through the room. James Warrington visibly tensed. I strongly advise my client to— Marcus slammed his fist against the table. This isn't over. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her tone as sharp as a blade. It is. Silence stretched. Then, finally, Marcus exhaled, shoulders slumping just enough to betray the truth. He knew he had lost. He reached for the resignation document. I want my lawyers to review this, he muttered. Take all the time you need, Rebecca said, but they both knew time was the last thing he had. As Marcus signed, the board members exchanged glances, the realization sinking in that the era of Marcus Sterling had come to an end. When he finished, Rebecca took the document and stood. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. You'll retain access to your penthouse for now. Any further violations of the agreement, and that too will be reconsidered. Marcus said nothing as two security personnel stepped forward. He hesitated, then turned to Vanessa. Are you coming with me? Vanessa met his gaze, then shook her head. No. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Marcus's eyes. He didn't argue. As he was led away, the weight of finality settled in the room. Rebecca turned back to the board. Now, she said, her voice steady, let's discuss the future of Sterling Industries. For the first time in 15 years, the power was truly hers. Rebecca Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her new office, gazing out over the city that had witnessed the rise and fall of the Sterling dynasty. The skyline was different this morning, not in its physical form, but in what it represented. The empire that had been carefully sculpted over 3 generations was no longer in the hands of a man who wielded power recklessly. It was in hers. For 15 years, she had existed in the shadows, an observer, a strategist, a silent force guiding Sterling Industries from behind the scenes. Today, that silence was broken. She was no longer the unseen architect of the company's stability. She was the face of its future. Behind her, the boardroom hummed with the murmur of executives, department heads, and key advisors. The previous day's events had been the first shockwave, but today marked the beginning of true transformation. Harold Winters sat at the far end of the table, his usual composed demeanor tinged with the weight of what had transpired. Across from him, members of the board whispered amongst themselves, still digesting the reality that Rebecca was no longer just the wife of Marcus Sterling. She was now their leader. Rebecca turned from the window and walked toward her seat at the head of the table. The moment she sat, all murmurs ceased. "Let's begin," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "I understand that yesterday was a day of unexpected shifts, but what we do today determines the course of Sterling Industries for the next decade." She placed a set of documents before her, hands steady, gaze unwavering. "The first priority is stabilizing operations. The damage Marcus caused with his unauthorized asset transfers must be addressed immediately. We've frozen all related accounts, but we need to reassure our investors and key partners that Sterling Industries remains a stronghold of integrity and vision." David Chen, seated to her left, nodded. "Our legal team has initiated asset recovery proceedings in Singapore. The forensic accountants confirm that most of the funds are still within reach." He slid a folder across the table. "Additionally, we've arranged for a press release to go out by noon, framing this as a restructuring effort rather than a crisis." Rebecca accepted the folder, flipping through its contents. "Good," she said. "We control the narrative, and we make it clear that Sterling Industries is not only surviving this transition but emerging stronger because of it." Harold leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "And Marcus?" Rebecca's expression remained unreadable. "He signed the agreement. He retains his personal assets, but his influence over this company is officially over. Any attempts to interfere with Sterling Industries in the future will be met with legal consequences." She looked around the table. "This transition is not about erasing history, but learning from it. We will not repeat the mistakes that led us here." A beat of silence followed before Harold gave a slow nod of approval. "Understood." From across the table, Victoria Zhao, the youngest member of the board, spoke. "What about long-term leadership? Are we considering an external hire for CEO?" Rebecca met her gaze without hesitation. "No, I will assume the role of CEO permanently." A ripple of reactions spread through the room. Some expected it, others had not dared to presume, but no one openly opposed it. Victoria studied Rebecca for a moment before nodding. "Then I assume we'll need a structural plan for succession." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Exactly. That's why today, in addition to confirming my role, I'm implementing a new governance framework." She gestured to David, who distributed another set of documents to the board. Sterling Industries will no longer operate as a dynasty where leadership is dictated by bloodline. We are restructuring as a merit-based corporation with clear accountability at every level." Harold glanced through the document and exhaled. "This is significant." "It is necessary," Rebecca countered. Marcus's downfall wasn't just about personal failure. It was about a system that allowed unchecked power. That ends now. Across the table, Vanessa Chen sat quietly, her hands resting over her pregnant belly. She had not spoken yet, but Rebecca saw the way she absorbed every detail, the way her mind processed the shift in the company's culture. She was no longer Marcus's pawn. She was a woman determining her own fate. Harold cleared his throat. "I support this." He glanced at the others. "And I assume no one here would be foolish enough to oppose a governance model that protects our shareholders and our company." No one disagreed. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Then it settled. Sterling Industries moves forward with stability, integrity, and leadership that earns its place. The meeting adjourned, and as the board members filed out, Rebecca remained seated, her gaze settling once more on the city beyond the glass. She had spent years waiting for this moment, and yet, now that it was here, she did not feel victorious. She felt resolute. Power had never been her goal. Protection had. Protection for the company her father-in-law built, for the employees who depended on it, and, most of all, for her children. The door opened behind her, and when she turned, it was Vanessa. "May I?" Rebecca nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. Vanessa sat, her expression unreadable. "I wanted to thank you, not just for what you did to expose Marcus, but for everything since." She glanced down briefly, as if still processing her own emotions. "I was naive." Rebecca shook her head. "You believed in someone who made you feel valued. That isn't naivety. That's human nature." Vanessa let out a breath, shaking her head. "I told myself I was different, that he respected me for my intelligence, but I was just another piece in his game." "You're more than that," Rebecca said evenly, "and you have choices now." Vanessa hesitated. "I received an offer from a firm in Hong Kong. It's a strong position, and I think I need a fresh start." Rebecca studied her. "A fresh start can be a powerful thing." Vanessa nodded, exhaling. "I want my son to know his family, but I don't want him raised under Marcus's shadow." Rebecca considered that for a moment. "Then we make sure he doesn't have to be." Vanessa blinked. "You would support that?" "Family is more than blood," Rebecca said simply. "It's the choices we make." For the first time in hours, Vanessa smiled. As she left, Rebecca turned back to the window, her mind already moving forward. The past had been dismantled, the present was being rebuilt, but the future, that was where the real challenge lay. She was ready. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. See you in the next video.